On today's Newsmakers, filmmaker Tim Mahoney takes us on a mission into better understanding the book of Revelation. His latest project, 7 Churches of Revelation, is 2 films, and it's fascinating. He gets into the ins and the outs of why he created it and what he is hoping audiences take away. With no further ado, here is Tim Mahoney. 7 Churches of Revelation. Tim Mahoney, you always have fascinating projects. Tell us about this one.
The 7 Churches of Revelation is a project that I felt, really important for Christians today. And the reason for that is because many people are wondering, they're feeling uneasy about the future, and they're wondering, are we living in the last days? And I think what I've learned was that the Christians at that time, when the book of Revelation was written, felt like they were living in the last days. So every century throughout history, there's been questions, is Christ going to be returning? And the letter that John, wrote, or the Revelation, he was visited and he was given this amazing look into the future. But a lot of people don't know how do I contextualize that right now?
What does it mean? Is it that, did it already happen? Is it going? Yeah.
Yeah. And boy, are there a lot of different views about that. So the 7 Churches of the Revelation project is 2 films, and they're coming out in theaters coming up here. And the reason why I got behind it is because I think that many Christians need to know, how do I live, right now, and what should I do? And the thing that's interesting is this film goes back, and actually there's a French filmmaker who saw one of my films, Patterns of Evidence, Exodus, and he was inspired. And he went to Turkey. He used the same approach. He looked for the pattern. He looked for the locations of the churches. He looked for the archaeology. And what we learn is we start to see what those early Christians were faced with. And we start to see the different churches. We're going to be looking at the very locations where these churches are. We're going to be looking at the archaeology.
Well, the topic interests everybody, right? Everybody loves, look, half the things coming out of Hollywood, they're end time stories, whether they're biblical or not. There's something about this topic that kind of brings people in, right?
Absolutely. And I felt what was so helpful about these films is you're going to follow this filmmaker, Christoph Hanover, and he's going to investigate. And you're going to learn some things that you can apply to your life in such a powerful way. And that's what I felt about it. It wasn't divisive. This is informative. But it's also amazing to see these locations and to see what those early churches were dealing with.
Well, some people will say, well, those lessons were only for those churches and they don't really matter beyond that. After working on this project, putting these 2 films out, they're about to come out, what would you say to those who would say, well, there's no lessons there for the future?
I would disagree completely. And the reason for that is that every one of these churches, you can see them reflected in our culture today. There are churches that are suffering greatly, and that's when the times of fire. There are Christians right now that are going through persecution. And why are they? Because they're being faithful to the gospel of Christ. And we need to pray for those churches. There are other churches that are I call it times of deception. It's really almost like compromise. It's easy to be deceived that these things don't matter and we should just compromise. And guess what? You get along. And you can get along, but that's not what Christ is telling us. Because the reason I know that is because the messages that he gave to those churches was very, very serious. So the question for all of us is, what type of church are we involved with? What kind of a mindset do we have? Have we lost our first love? The very first church was the Church of Ephesus. I'm going to take you in this film to the location, exactly where these churches were. You're going to see the archaeology. You're going to see all of the remains that they might have, and you're going to basically go on this journey that John is taking us on.
How did your faith change, or how was it impacted as a result of this film? You've done a lot of films now on really interesting biblical subject matter.
Wake up. I think we can be deceived. We can be compromised, and we better wake up, because are we prepared? There's a warning in these churches. The warning is, are you going to be in the kingdom? In some ways, I mean, it's a very serious warning that we have to the churches. And my concern for myself and for anyone else is, are we really doing the things we're supposed to be doing right now? Because we can be deceived over time. It's like they talked about the frog. You put it in a kettle and you turn the heat on, and it can boil itself because it gets slowly gradual to that temperature. Our culture is changing the temperature. Things that are good, that used to be good, are now shifting, and we're changing the narratives so that good is evil and evil is good. And we have to be so cautious. And I think that's the thing that I saw about these churches. The ones that were faithful, those were out of 7 churches, only 2 were given a good report card. And I think you could see that even in our own culture today.
Yeah, I mean, even talking with Dr. Barna and, George Barna, and you look at the numbers, 41% of pastors have a biblical worldview. I mean, these numbers may not be far off in terms of the churches today.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And if we lose that, we have to be very, very careful. There's a narrow and there's a broad path. The broad path leads to destruction. And I think I've gone and filmed, as you know, many, many scholars, people who grew up in Christian environments, and they've walked away or turned away from the faith for one reason or the other. And I think that we have to be careful that we don't walk away from the things that God is saying. Hey, why aren't you faithful? Or have you lost your first love? As I talked about with the Church of Ephesus, they lost their first love. And so if the Lord were to give us a report card, what's interesting about them is that some of them have been doing some good things, but there are things that the Lord is not happy with, and we have to be careful. That's why I think this film is so helpful in bringing people to a deeper understanding, because I don't think it's going to get any better. I think we have to be prepared and prepare our hearts for what might happen in the future. And that means preparing our minds as well. For more on the films or to get copies, head over to 7churches.com. We'll see you tomorrow for another episode of Newsmakers.